On September 2, 2019, it was Labor Day in Ohio. Hocking Hills State Park was crowded with visitors. It was one of the busiest days of the year. Among the visitors was 44-year-old photographer Victoria Schaefer. She was working, taking senior portraits for a group of high school students. Everything was going smoothly. The shoot was almost finished. The students were walking near a staircase inside the park when it happened. A sudden loud crack echoed through the area. At first, nobody understood what they heard. Then someone turned around. Victoria was on the ground, not moving. A large log lay beside her. Panic started immediately. Someone ran for help. A 911 call came in describing a falling branch or log. But even the caller sounded confused, because nothing about it made sense. When emergency responders arrived, they confirmed the worst. Victoria Schaefer was dead. And now the case shifted from emergency response to investigation. Officers from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources began examining the scene. Ohio Department of Natural Resources investigators immediately noticed something unusual. The log was heavy, around 75 pounds. Not something that simply falls naturally from a cliff without reason. So they went to the top of the cliff. What they found changed everything. There was a pile of logs, cut and placed together, far from the edge, too far to roll naturally. Which meant one thing: the log had been moved. And if it was moved, then someone had to be there. Now the investigation became more serious. Hocking County Sheriff's Office was called in. They began treating the case as suspicious. Because now investigators weren't just dealing with a fall. They were dealing with human action. Witnesses were interviewed. People in the park that day were identified. And slowly, a timeline started forming. Several visitors reported seeing teenagers in the upper cliff area before the incident. At first, it didn't seem important. But now it did. Because the key question became: who was near that log before it went over? Investigators began narrowing down who was in that exact location at the exact time. And that's when things started to tighten. The timeline showed a very small window. Just minutes between when the group was seen near the cliff and when the emergency call was made. Inside that window, the log was moved. Victoria was struck, and the group left the area. But what still wasn't clear was how it happened. So investigators focused on statements. At first, everyone described a normal hike. Walking around, exploring, hearing commotion, then leaving. But when detectives compared statements side by side, small differences appeared. Not big enough at first to stand out, but enough to matter. Some details didn't match. Some actions were unclear. And one detail kept coming back. Someone interacted with the log before it went over. But how exactly that happened kept changing depending on who was speaking. That became the focus. Because in cases like this, the truth usually sits inside one simple question: who touched the log? And what did they expect would happen next? As investigators pressed further, the story began to shift slightly. Not completely changing, but no longer stable. And that's when detectives realized something important. This was no longer about whether someone was present. It was about what exactly they did in those final moments before the log went over. And that question would decide the entire direction of the case. As investigators tightened their focus, the interviews became more direct. No more general storytelling. No more loose timelines. Now it was about exact actions. Exact positions. Exact moments. Because at this point, they already knew something important. The log did not move on its own. The only question left was how it moved, and who was closest when it did. Detectives returned to the individuals who had been in the upper cliff area that day. This time, the atmosphere was different. The questions were sharper. The comparisons were immediate. And every answer was being measured against the physical layout of the cliff. Inside Hocking Hills State Park, investigators walked them through the scene step by step. Where they stood. Where they walked. Where the log was first seen. And where it went over. At first, the explanation stayed simple. Just a hike. Just wandering. Just confusion after hearing a loud sound. But when investigators placed them physically at the exact edge, the story began to tighten under pressure. Because standing there changes perception. The drop is steep. The trail below is visible. And the idea of a 75-pound object moving from that point suddenly becomes harder to explain casually. Investigators then reconstructed the log's original location. The pile was still intact far from the edge. Cleanly positioned. Not scattered by nature. Which meant the movement had to be deliberate at some stage. That detail removed the accident theory further from possibility. Now investigators focused on the sequence. The only thing that mattered was order. Who was near the logs first? Who interacted with them? And who was closest when the incident happened? As they broke down the timeline, a narrow window became clear. Just minutes between last confirmed sighting of the group near the cliff and the emergency response below. Inside that short window, the log was moved. Victoria Schaefer was struck. And the group left the immediate area. That tight sequence left very little room for confusion. So investigators returned to statements again. This time, asking for exact steps. Not stories. Steps. Where did you walk first? What did you touch? Who was beside you? And what happened at the edge? Under that pressure, the details began to shift slightly. Not dramatically. But enough to notice. Some movements were reworded. Some actions became uncertain. And some moments were described in a way that avoided direct responsibility. That's when investigators realized the core issue. The problem wasn't just what was being said. It was what no one could clearly explain. How the log moved from a safe pile to a deadly drop. Because every version of the story struggled with that single point. And without that explanation, the accident theory kept collapsing under its own weight. So investigators shifted focus one final time. They stopped asking for explanations. And started comparing statements directly against the terrain. Because the ground does not change its story. And when they did that, one thing became undeniable. A heavy log does not travel from a controlled pile to a cliff edge without force. And once force is involved, responsibility becomes unavoidable. At this point, investigators were no longer searching for possibilities. They were narrowing down accountability. Because someone in that group was no longer just present at the scene. They were connected to the action that started it. And as the case reached its final stage, the truth was no longer hiding in the story. It was locked inside the contradiction between what was said and what the cliff made physically possible. And that contradiction was about to define everything that came next. Investigators were now down to the final question. Not what happened in general, but what exactly caused the log to go over the edge. At this point, every statement had been compared to the physical scene. Every timeline had been rebuilt. And every version of the story had been tested against the cliff itself. And slowly, the accident theory stopped holding up. Because the environment inside Hocking Hills State Park simply did not support a natural explanation. The log pile was too far from the edge. The terrain was too uneven for accidental rolling. And the weight of the log made uncontrolled movement unlikely without direct force. So investigators focused on the only explanation left that matched the physical evidence. Human interaction. Not nature. Not chance. Action. Under continued questioning, the timeline became clearer. A group had been in the upper cliff area. The logs were accessible. And at some point, one of them was moved from the pile toward the edge. What followed happened quickly. Too quickly for full awareness to stop it once it started. The log went over the cliff. And below, Victoria Schaefer was struck. When investigators mapped everything together, the positions, the timing, and the movement, they reached a difficult conclusion. This was not consistent with a simple accident caused by nature alone. It was the result of actions taken at the edge of a dangerous drop, in a public space, on a busy holiday. And even if intent was unclear in the beginning, the responsibility for what happened could not be ignored. The final interviews focused less on guessing and more on accountability. Who was closest to the log? Who physically interacted with it? And who failed to report what happened immediately afterward? Because in investigations like this, what happens after the incident can matter just as much as the moment itself. And when all the evidence was aligned, the story no longer stayed fragmented. It became a chain of events that investigators could follow step by step. From a controlled pile, to movement, to impact, to silence. And at the center of it all was a simple but heavy truth. A life was lost because something was moved when it should not have been. Not by nature alone, but by decisions made in real time. And once that realization set in, the case stopped being a mystery of what happened, and became a question of responsibility. Before we end this video, if you've followed this case to the end, thank you for watching Cold Case 247. If you enjoy real investigations, true crime stories, and detailed breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe right now. And don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below telling us what you think really happened that day. Was it an accident that went wrong? Or a chain of decisions that should never have happened in the first place?